By passing behind our lines, Apollo, the bane of our war effort here in Greece, had finally made his first mistake. Maximus, the recently appointed commander of his own legion, knew he couldn't match the likes of Apollo on the field. Instead, he would make sure someone the legions would risk everything for could. Maximus would entrap Apollo inside our lands. With Octavian, the heart of our cause, closing in from Hellas, Apollo was on the ropes. Any ships he may have had at his disposal to save him, our fleets cut down. There was no room for error. The presence of Octavian was so immense, Apollo dared to retreat back to Apollonia. Halfway through, however, Octavian caught up with him. Artillery went feral, firing straight into the tightly packed approaching cohorts. The advance was slow, calculated, but once the troops engaged and distinction between the two sides became impossible, Octavian secretly commanded his artillery to fire straight into the mayhem, crushing through the thick Lorica segmentate armor. All to stress Apollo, making him spend all his energy on maintaining morale instead of using his tactical brilliance. The moment Apollo tried to escape, our scorpions locked in, forcing him to turn around. Our cavalry caught him and after a valiant last stand, fell off his horse. Whatever enemies that remained stood no chance. Now that Apollo was gone, the Antonine lands was once more open for conquest. The Illyrian coastline was immediately turned back over to our side. Both Octavian and Maximus marched for Thrace, from where they would coordinate their strikes with the stout defenders of Pella, Calvinus. Aquilinus prepared a new army that too was to help out. The full force of our side was about to rain hellfire upon their enemies. Similar to how the war in the north was mounting, so too was it down in the south, where Agrippa at last made ready to advance. But before he could reach Antonine lands proper, he had to overcome the Roman subjects Judea and Nabatea, whom both had sided with Antony at the start of the war. Neither were willing to back down, even though that by far would have been the better choice for them. The Judeans in particular were only acting tough in spirit, but fled at the first sight of the victorious legion, trying to find a way back into their prized city. It was in vain pinning them down outside their walls. They didn't stand a chance. Jerusalem almost instantly surrendered, leaving the Nabateans isolated from the rest of their allies. But back in Thrace, instead of marching as one unstoppable army, Octavian deemed the individual strength of each legion was more than capable of standing on their own feet, and thus decided to send Calvinus north to seize the Dacian lands. However, worrying reports made it so that Octavian was to keep a second legion near his side. The issue was that Archelaus, the Pontic general whom had been tormenting our allies before our arrival, had escaped the eyes of our deep-rooted network of intel. It was as if he had vanished. At least for now. Hopefully you understand why this was a worrying fact. Therefore, when the Numidians, who were far away from any of our armies, decided to end their military alliance with us, I became quite worried. Not only for the state of our nation, but also for Octavian. In order to install some form of safety in the lands we fight to protect, Aquilinus was tasked to fall back and make ready to defend our civilians if necessary. Of course, he wasn't alone in the matter, as our legions all the way back in Hispania was garrisoned on the border. Especially telling the Numidians if they want to fuck around, they will find out. Basically, this meant to Octavian that his conquest of Thrace was slowed down, especially upon defeating one army at the start of the winter season and thus had to wait on reinforcements to arrive. The entire winter the Antonine armies basically kept shadowing us, but refusing to engage, as if they were waiting for us to make a mistake. Thankfully, our little spiders kept our intel fresh, so that wouldn't happen. This was also the main reason for Agrippa applying a similar amount of minions to report of enemy troop movement. However, more interesting were the whispers of potential Parthian support. Supposedly, Mark Antony had been fighting our eastern neighbor so ferociously that they were debating whether to invest in our side of the conflict. Maybe they thought of us as easily controllable or something. No matter how you interpret it, the Parthians were a potential rival not to be trusted. We would never forget what they did. For the moment, we would keep up the ruse, while we dealt with the Nabateans, who similarly to the Judeans fled further into their own lands. At least this time there was some logic to it, considering how their knowledge of the Arabian desert was unrivaled, with us surely falling the same way Crassus did back in the day, if we dared to pursue. By the arrival of spring, Agrippa decided to attack an Nabatean army, expecting it to be isolated and vulnerable, just to end up facing twice the numbers of his own. In order to even the odds slightly, Agrippa concentrated his attack on the left and used his specialized Iberian auxiliary cavalry to bring down the Nabatean camel riders. Our infantry made a swift and successful breakthrough, hurtling the enemy into a tight blob that we easily could surround and crush. Despite the victory, our line suffered heavy casualties, slowing down our efforts even further. Making the Nabateans capitulate wasn't gonna be easy. During the same time of that battle, the Thracian campaign finally progressed. The Antonine armies backed off, unsure of how to maintain the front line without Pullo. Calvinus dropped into Dacia, but kept having an Antonine army shadowing him, a propaganda-made army whose name foolishly tried to appeal to our historic and noble commanders of our origin. It was supposedly the Victrix Legion. They were looking for opportunities to strike, but in doing so left nearby towns vulnerable. As the shadow of ours too passed into Dacia, fears of yet another potential catastrophic confrontation entered our minds. We had to act, and fast. Octavian marched out to intercept, but immediately made a second crossing over the Danube as the other allied army wasn't ready to engage. This obviously left Octavian, the far superior prize over some simple town in foreign lands, vulnerable. A hard-fought battle ensued where Octavian barely exposed the blatant lies that was Antony's attempt to mirror the legacy of the Victrix Legion. Following this victory, our legion spread out to seize as much ground as possible, while our spies went on the hunt for the instigator of this damned war. It was then our agents discovered Mark Antony in fact had abandoned his greedy war against the Parthians in favor of taking personal control over the Western Front. He was the one to take over Pullo's role. Apparently the reason for our fortunes had something to do with Antony being forced to coerce and intimidate the Pontic allies to fall back in line. I must say that is fair considering how Achilles simply disappeared when he was needed the most. A traitor to the last, exactly what you could expect from a former enemy of Rome. With the Parthian front abandoned, marching up the Levant was almost too easy. All it really did was fuel our quest for a swift takeover. Without Roman legions to defend Roman interest, Parthian armies freely marched into Roman lands, stealing from Roman citizens. The Parthians considered us a potential ally, and they went on to do something like that. Heretics, the whole lot of them. Oh, and do you remember that army led by Aquilinus we sent back to Italy in anticipation of a Numidian attack? Turns out the Numidians were the least of our concerns. Not only had this civil war led to so many internal issues, putting a strain on the communities of our nation like here in Sicily, but now another migrating barbarian horde declared their intentions of trespassing through our lands. The lands of Cisalpine was set ablaze, and to an extent Rome herself was at risk. Aquilinus was immediately sent on his way, but time wasn't on our side, and if we didn't react, there would be no end to the destruction. We began working on 2 additional legions to save our capital. Back in Thrace, the Pontics had gone rogue, pillaging the Roman settlements bordering the Black Sea. It wasn't necessarily a major threat, but did cause some issues for our war effort, as Octavian and Maximus already had crossed into Anatolia, where the plan was for Octavian to deal with Mark Antony, while Maximus went on to confront the Pontic holdings. This was a massive undertaking. It was on this very expedition he triggered Achilles to step out of the shadow, meeting Maximus of all people on the field in the wet hills. It did appear as if they didn't anticipate our presence this close to home, and as such wasn't even facing us at the start of the engagement. They immediately moved towards our position. We had set up on a much smaller hill adjacent to the one Achilles and his troops marched upon, but with a small dent in between, the perfect killing zone. Our artillery blasted away during their approach. As they closed in, our troops rushed into action, but in doing so ran straight into a frontal charge, sending some flying into a splattering and bone-breaking end. Progressively, the right flank came under excruciating pressure, up to the point where one entire cohort was completely isolated, and on the verge of letting the entire flank collapse. Maximus wasn't about to let this many soldiers meet an early grave, and thus sent his entire reserve to save and extract the cohort. It was a miserable and desperate attempt that almost failed, yet by the blessing of Mars the cohort safely made it out. As for Achilles, the man leading the attack, survival wasn't part of his future. The heroic efforts of Maximus ensured the end of Achilles and subsequently paved the way for our ruthless offensive, receiving naval support along the way in anticipation of repelling the well-known and frequent pirate incursions that could happen up here at the Black Sea. Back at home, the situation was getting out of hand. More and more Northern migrators traveled into our lands and were now laying siege to Medland. We tried to bribe the local Celts to intervene, but they saw no need to help us. We had to defend ourselves. Calling for the armies along the Rhine was impossible due to the enormous Germanic attacks, even against our own Nervii subjects whom we were obligated to defend. While the Romans fought themselves, the world seemed to take notice and exploit it, reveling in our despair. If not for the fact that Octavian, Maximus and even Agrippa down in the Levant were bringing back the Roman taxpayers into our united nation, we wouldn't be able to afford our survival. This also would put a further strain on our limited defensive capabilities, a strain that could break if the Parthians too deemed Octavian's rulership a threat similar to that of Mark Antony. Of course, the invasions of our western lands were inevitably repelled and defeated, but it was a clear sign that no matter how much we tried, diplomacy with barbarians beyond the Rhine or Alps would never cease, even if we butchered every single one of their fighters. As for the war against Mark Antony, the traitor had made a hasty escape eastwards upon realizing how truly fucked his defenses were. In fact, by the time Agrippa marched into Antioch, Antony was spotted heading for Armenia, perhaps seeking to escape into the distant steppes. Further, we weren't the only ones seeking to bring injustice to Antony. The Parthians too were after him. The chase was on. Agrippa made his pursuit fighting his way through Samosata and the other defenses standing in his way. They were this close to one another at the furthest the Roman civilization had ever reached. Nevertheless, despite our great efforts to catch him, we were just moments too late. The once enemy of Octavian, the man driven into killing his own kinsmen by a foreign hostile traitor, had been slain by the Parthian horse archers. Seeing this as some sick favor, the Parthians served Agrippa the head of Antony in a box, claiming they had done this in good faith. But they had forgotten one thing. Mark Antony wasn't just any ordinary Roman. No, he was part of the Triumvirate, a former consul of Rome. Such a murder couldn't go unpunished. War was declared with our own invasion beginning near Palmyra, and Agrippa himself going to punish the Parthian murderers. Nightmarish tales had been told about how the Lake Crassus tragically fell to the Parthian horse archers, and Agrippa wasn't about to willingly follow his example. Instead of letting enemy ranged units pepper his slow and tightly packed troops, Agrippa decided to take full advantage of the sheer size of our scutum shields, forming 7 separatist duo formations, organized on the outer perimeter of our wedge tactic that was meant to protect our more vulnerable skirmishers from direct cavalry contact. As we closed in, the Parthians rushed forward at tremendous haste. With projectiles flying overhead, the crushing cataphract trembled into our tucked-in troops. Having shields held above our heads made the onslaught so much more devastating. Our flanks were under tremendous stress, and if we didn't react, the cavalry would overrun our men. So Agrippa gave the orders to reform into a shield wall. It was all about sustaining our crumbling lines long enough for our skirmishers to bring down the enemy. A game of patience until the Parthians made their first blatant mistake. On the right, the enemy had come too close enough for us to push back. It was now Agrippa sent forth his auxiliary cavalry, brought along all the way from Hispania to push out and overcome their otherwise superior strength. The battle was a Roman victory, but the cost of retribution was too great. Agrippa barely made it out alive. Not to forget this rekindled the otherwise de-escalating conflict with the Parthians. There was no peace in sight with our eastern neighbors any longer. Without Mark Antony to lead the opposition, the remaining Antonine supporters quickly yielded to Octavian's rule. He stood as the undisputed leader of Rome with the legions firmly under his command. Yet even with near limitless resources and ambition, the empire soon found itself stretched to its breaking point, surrounded by hostile frontiers and with an eastern superpower looming. Rome's age of expansion was nearing its limit, but regardless of what trials lay ahead, one thing was certain: Rome was no longer a republic. It had become a full-on empire.